Welcome to my channel. Enjoy listening. First story, Abandoned Lighthouse. When I was 19, I spent a summer working at a small marina on the northern coast of Maine. It was a quiet town, with nothing but endless forests, jagged cliffs, and the cold Atlantic stretching as far as you could see. Most nights, the waves were the only sounds, and the wind had a way of making you feel like you were being watched. The town had one peculiar landmark, an old, abandoned lighthouse that sat on a tiny, rocky island just offshore. It hadn't been operational for decades. People in town rarely spoke of it, and when they did, there was always a strange tension in their voices, like they were hiding something. Occasionally, someone would dare another to take a boat out there, but nobody ever did. The few that tried never stayed long. I never paid much attention to it. That is, until the night I decided to go. It was a dare, of course. One too many drinks around the fire with some of the locals. You wouldn't last 5 minutes out there, one guy slurred. No one does. I scoffed. It's just a lighthouse. I'll be back before you even finish your beer. With my pride on the line and half my brain clouded with alcohol, I grabbed a small rowboat from the dock and started paddling toward the island. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its black silhouette standing stark against the moonlit sky. The closer I got, the more I felt something in the pit of my stomach. A growing unease, like I was being drawn towards something I shouldn't disturb. I reached the shore quickly, pulling the boat onto the rocks. The island was dead silent, and the air was colder than it had been on the mainland. The lighthouse towered above me, its windows shattered, the door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. The structure seemed much larger up close, and something about it felt wrong, like it was leaning slightly, just enough to make you question your sense of balance. I took a deep breath and headed inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing up the spiral staircase that wound its way to the top of the tower. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with the smell of mildew. I shone my flashlight around, illuminating broken furniture, peeling walls, and graffiti left by the few who had dared to come before me. But something else caught my attention, something out of place. In the middle of the floor, surrounded by dust and debris, was a small, perfectly clean circle. It was almost like someone had swept the area recently, even though no one had set foot on the island in years. And at the center of that circle sat a single object, an old brass key, glinting in the beam of my flashlight. I hesitated, my hand hovering above the key. It didn't make sense. Who would leave something like this here? And why was the floor clean when the rest of the lighthouse was filthy? Against my better judgment, I picked it up. The second my fingers touched the key, the temperature in the room dropped, and I felt a strange vibration run through my body, like something was awakening. The wind outside picked up, howling through the cracks in the walls, and I could hear a faint sound, like whispers too far away to understand. I pocketed the key and glanced around, suddenly feeling like I wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, just the creaks of an old building settling, but deep down, I knew better. I turned toward the staircase, planning to head to the top and prove to myself it was all in my head. But as I put my foot on the first step, something strange happened. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in. The whispers were louder now, clearer, like they were just around the corner. They weren't in English or any language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was warning me to leave. Suddenly, the staircase groaned, and I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved, slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't human. It didn't have a face, just a dark, shifting form that seemed to suck the light from the air around it. I stumbled back, tripping over debris, and bolted for the door. As I ran, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, following, closing in. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to stop me from leaving. I burst out of the lighthouse, slamming the door behind me and sprinting toward the boat. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel something watching me, something angry, something that didn't want me to leave. I rowed back to the mainland as fast as I could, my hands shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the shore, the others were waiting. laughing at how fast I had returned, but their smiles faded when they saw my face. I didn't tell them what happened. I didn't need to. They knew. The next morning, I found the key in my pocket. I don't know why I took it, or what it unlocked. I haven't been back to the lighthouse since, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers. Second story, the reflection that wasn't mine. A few years ago, I experienced something that I still can't explain. I never believed in ghosts or anything paranormal, but this was different. This was something that defied everything I thought I knew about reality. It started when I moved into a new apartment. It was an older place, tucked away in a quiet part of the city, but the rent was cheap, and I didn't think twice about it. The apartment itself was nothing special. Small, kind of run down, but it had this massive mirror in the bedroom. It covered nearly the entire wall opposite my bed. Normally, I wasn't a fan of sleeping with mirrors facing me, but it was bolted to the wall, and removing it seemed like too much of a hassle. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, settling in, and trying to ignore how the mirror always seemed to reflect the room just a little too perfectly. It was subtle, but every now and then, something felt off. I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked directly at it, everything was normal. Then, one night, things escalated. I had been up late, working on a project for work. The apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making the air feel heavier. I was exhausted, so I turned off my laptop and climbed into bed. As I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I noticed something strange in the mirror. At first, I thought it was just my reflection, lying there in bed like always, but as I glanced over, I realized something wasn't right. My reflection wasn't moving. It was lying perfectly still, even though I was shifting slightly, trying to get comfortable. I sat up quickly, staring at the mirror. My reflection sat up too, but there was a delay, just a second or two behind my movements, like a video out of sync. I waved my hand slowly, and sure enough, the reflection copied me, but again, it was delayed. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I got out of bed, stepping closer to the mirror, trying to figure out what was going on. My reflection stood up too, but there was something wrong with its face. It wasn't quite me. The features were a little too sharp, the eyes a little too dark. It was subtle, but enough to make my stomach twist with unease. I leaned closer, examining it, and that's when it happened. My reflection smiled. I didn't smile. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The thing in the mirror just stood there, grinning at me with that twisted, wrong version of my own face. For a few seconds, we stared at each other. Me, frozen in terror, and the reflection, mocking me with that awful smile. Then, it moved. It turned around. That's when I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. The reflection's room wasn't quite the same as mine. The bed was in the wrong place, the lamp on the nightstand was missing, and there was a door in the corner of the room that didn't exist in my apartment. I stood there, paralyzed, as the reflection walked toward the door. It opened it slowly, and beyond it was darkness. Not just a shadowy room, but pitch black, empty void. The thing in the mirror glanced back at me, still grinning, then stepped through the door and disappeared into the darkness. I was shaking at this point, but I had to know if it was really gone. I stepped closer to the mirror, my breath fogging up the glass, and looked into the room on the other side. The reflection was gone. The room was empty, but the door was still there. I stumbled back, not taking my eyes off the mirror. The door remained open, and even though I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond, I could feel it. Something was there, watching me from the other side. I grabbed a blanket, threw it over the mirror, and spent the rest of the night in my living room. The next morning, I called the landlord and demanded that the mirror be removed. He came by later that day with a maintenance guy, and together they pried the mirror off the wall. Behind it was a large, old-fashioned door, hidden away behind the plaster. The landlord looked just as confused as I was. "I had no idea this was here," he said, shaking his head. "The building's too old. Blueprints are a mess. Who knows what this used to be?" I asked him to seal the door. I didn't want to know where it led, or what was behind it. They covered the door, plastered over it, and I moved out a few days later. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I still wonder what was on the other side of that door, and if it ever came looking for me. Third story. The radio station at the end of the world. A few years ago, I worked as an intern at a small radio station in the middle of nowhere. It was a tiny, independent station, broadcasting only locally, and it was mostly a dead-end job for me, perfect for getting some experience while figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. The station was located in an old, creaky building on the edge of a forest. It had been around for decades, and rumors about the place were just as old. The staff often joked about the place being haunted, but nobody really took it seriously. It was just an old building in a remote location. One night, while everyone else had left for the day, I was alone in the station, finishing up some paperwork and preparing for the next day's broadcast. The station had a library of old vinyl records, and I was curious about them, so I decided to play a few as I worked. The station's equipment was ancient, but it still worked. Around midnight, as I was flipping through records, I found an old, dusty vinyl labeled Emergency Broadcast. The label was handwritten, and I assumed it was just a recording from decades ago. Curious, I decided to play it. The record crackled to life, and at first, it seemed like a standard emergency broadcast. The voice was clipped, authoritative, and calm, giving information about some long-forgotten disaster or warning. But then the tone shifted. The voice grew increasingly frantic, the sentences becoming disjointed and more desperate. "Do not go outside," it said. "The danger is real. It's all around you. Do not." The recording abruptly cut off. Static filled the airwaves, then silence. I stared at the turntable, confused. The sudden end of the broadcast made my skin crawl. I was alone in a dark, silent building, and the eerie message seemed to echo through the empty rooms. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread and decided to investigate. I walked through the station, turning on the lights and checking the building. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I went back to the main studio, trying to focus on my work. The old radio equipment was still running, the low hum filling the room. Then, out of nowhere, the equipment started broadcasting a strange, unfamiliar frequency. The static was louder than usual, and through it, I could hear faint, distorted voices. I fiddled with the knobs, trying to clear up the signal, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be speaking in a language I didn't understand, and the tone was urgent, almost pleading. The voices blended into a cacophony of static and noise, and I could barely make out individual words. "Help us. Cannot escape. They're here." The voices became more frantic, and the static intensified. I felt a chill run down my spine. My breath quickened, and I started to feel trapped. The building seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter with each passing second. In a panic, I tried to turn off the equipment, but nothing worked. The voices continued to echo through the station, growing louder and more chaotic. I grabbed my phone and called for help, but the call dropped immediately, the line going dead. Desperate, I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. As I reached the entrance, the power cut out entirely. The building was plunged into darkness. I could hear the voices clearly now, screaming, pleading, and angry. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I fumbled for the flashlight on my phone, turning it on just as I saw a shadow dart past the doorframe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow was fleeting, but it was enough to make me feel like I wasn't alone. I pushed through the door and ran to my car. The engine roared to life, and I sped away from the station, not daring to look back. I drove straight to the nearest town and didn't stop until I reached the safety of a well-lit diner. The next day, I contacted the station manager and told him what happened. He seemed concerned but dismissive, attributing it to the old equipment and my overactive imagination. When I offered to show him the recording, he just shook his head and said, "That place has a way of messing with people's heads." I never returned to that station. I left town shortly after and took a job elsewhere. I tried to forget the experience, but sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about those desperate voices and wondering if they were trying to warn me, or if they were calling me to join them in the darkness. The station remains abandoned, and the building is slowly being overtaken by the forest. I've heard rumors from locals that the radio equipment is still broadcasting, but nobody who goes out there ever comes back.